Shelter in place. Applause for the D.C. homeowner who let dozens of protesters stay in his home overnight after the group said they were boxed in by police in riot gear. America under curfew. Just as many cities begin to reopen, new lockdowns as vandals and looters attempt to bring violence to the nation's protest. New York City tightens its grip after high-end stores were targeted. Hundreds of arrests as demonstrations call for justice in the name of George Floyd.
At the end of the day, they get to go home and be with their family. Shiana does not have a father. I'm here for my baby. And I'm here for George because I want justice for him.
Saying his name. Emotional moments today for the family of George Floyd. His daughter left without a father. Thousands gather in his hometown. The police chief among those marching in his name. The president's photo op, anger over President Trump's walk to that historic church holding up a Bible. Peaceful protesters pushed from the area with tear gas. Lawmakers from both parties now expressing frustration with the president. Meanwhile, former Vice President Biden is hammering the president, calling for police reform. Breaking news, 6 officers now face charges in Atlanta following that incident involving 2 college students caught up in a protest, and it's all caught on tape. Good evening, everyone. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us. Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. Sojourner Truth said that back in 1851, and 169 years later, that same sentiment holds true. There is a racket in this country that is not dying down. It's been more than 1 week since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the protests continue. Each day, like clockwork, they march. Tens of thousands, whether clutching signs, bullhorns, or empty-handed, they are united in their message, enough. Take a look at the scene in Floyd's hometown of Houston today. Thousands turned out for this peaceful protest at City Hall organized by some of his family members. And in New York City, because of all the protests, effective immediately, regular days off have been canceled for uniformed police officers. All 36,000 officers are now working 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts until further notice. And now further fueling the fire, the message from the president. Stephanie Ramos leads us off.
Today, the images of protest from across the country just hours before new curfews go into effect. From San Francisco to Orlando to New York City, thousands marching in protest with a message of peace.
We are not looking to agitate or to loot or destroy anything. We are trying to make the community unified. And by doing that, it's not unifying the community, it's breaking it apart.
The city now moving up its curfew to 8 o'clock tonight after a 4th night of looting. Peaceful demonstration by day replaced with a vicious cycle of violence overnight. Windows smashed, stores ransacked from the Macy's flagship store to Rockefeller Center.
The sun has gone down here in New York City, and there are clearly different groups that are out here facing off with police, shattering windows here along 5th Avenue.
The governor today blasting the mayor and police department.
And the police in New York City were not effective at doing their job last night, period.
Hundreds of arrests, most after curfew. Police investigating this video showing a car slamming into an officer in a hit and run in the Bronx. That officer in serious condition.
It appears to be quite purposeful. That's unacceptable.
Overnight, officers shot during violent protests in Las Vegas, one in grave condition. Another 4 officers were shot in St. Louis.
Thank God they're alive. They're alive. But what? Can we make some sense out of this?
Across the country, police tactics under scrutiny. LA's police chief sparking outrage after suggesting looters were as responsible for George Floyd's death as those fired police officers.
We didn't have people mourning the death of this man, George Floyd. We had people capitalizing. His death is on their hands, as much as it is those officers.
The chief later apologizing, calling his own words terribly offensive. Today, LA officers kneeling with protesters at a faith-based march. In New York, the police chief also taking a knee.
Let New York show the country how this is done.
At times, police torn between patrol and protest. This officer in D.C. seen trying to kneel, only to be repeatedly pulled to his feet by his fellow officers. In Detroit, 16-year-old organizer Stephen Perez has been urging his fellow demonstrators to abide by the city's curfew.
But they home safe. They don't got rubber bullets. They don't got tear gas. They're not dead.
The mayor calling to thank him.
And I saw your leadership. I have tears in my eyes. You are everything that's special about the city of Detroit. We're going to fight this injustice because of people like you.
Stephanie Ramos joins us live on the streets of New York City. Stephanie, the curfew is now in full effect. Describe what you are seeing and hearing and what's happening around you right now.
Well, right now, Lindsay, it is clear here at Columbus Circle, but that was not the case a few moments ago. There were hundreds of demonstrators that made their way through here, and you could also see NYPD officers trying to enforce that curfew that is now in place, corralling them from every angle, from east to west, coming up from the south. And a number of the demonstrators that I spoke with said they have no intention of going home, so it's going to be very difficult to enforce that curfew here tonight.
So are they being arrested or detained at this point simply for violating the curfew or because of some kind of mischief?
So right now, what I've heard from others, from some of our colleagues that were leaving ABC here at Columbus Circle while that was taking place, they actually did see a couple of demonstrators on the ground and being detained. Now, we actually saw NYPD officers going into their patrol vehicles and taking out zip ties, a number of zip ties, and they were organizing. We could hear the officers talking to one another, saying they were which direction they were going to go in. And at this time, we understand there's just further up north, there are a couple of blocks that are blocked off by officers. So they're really trying to not make the same mistakes that were made yesterday. We were along Fifth Avenue when we saw hundreds and hundreds of people descend on Fifth Avenue and smashing windows, and they basically overwhelmed the area. There were not enough officers in place there. So I think NYPD officers are trying to avoid that here tonight. And standing right here, we've seen a number of patrol vehicles drive by, and again, from all directions, they seem to be really trying to enforce that 8 o'clock curfew, Lindsay.
For sure, and we've just been taking live images while you've been talking, and that's what we're seeing at home. Really, no protesters on the streets of those particular shots that we're seeing from the helicopter, but a very great police presence here in New York City. All right, Stephanie Ramos, thank you so much. And now let's move out west, and specifically to Seattle, where we saw some violent clashes take place last night. Seattle's mayor speaking out on protest a little while ago, hoping for a calmer night ahead. We should note that you are looking at protesters. I believe that you're about to see, but hearing the mayor speak. Take a listen.
And so the first step is, if you'll do me the honor that we can set up a process. We're working with a community police commission, which represents community, but with people right here that you select to help start talking about what are the specific and concrete things we need to change and how do we make it change.
And that was the voice, again, of Seattle's mayor. Let's bring in ABC's Kaylee Hartung, who is on the ground there in Seattle. Kaylee, what do things look like for you right now?
Lindsay, what you see behind me is a group of peaceful demonstrators who gathered there, listened to the mayor speak to them. I want to bring in Shai and David, two of the people here instrumental in getting the mayor to have that conversation with this group. Tell me what that conversation was like with the mayor to have her address the hundreds that have come together here.
Honestly, a lot of the conversation was just us trying to get her outside as fast as possible. We recognize that this message is not ours. We just simply were kind of chosen as leaders. But we fell into this. We stand for these people.
What was your reaction to what the mayor said to this group?
Honestly, it was, at least for me, it was empowering, simply because she really let us know that she saw us, she heard us, she disagreed with what she saw happening in the video, she disagreed with how we were treated the other day and the last couple of days, and she made sure that we knew that, and that was really, really reassuring to hear
also unimpressed. I will continue. I'm very anxious and excited to see how these peace talks continue.
And you all are scheduled to continue conversations in earnest tomorrow.
Correct.
What do you want her to hear in that conversation?
So tomorrow we're expecting her to hear our complaints. Tomorrow we're expecting her to hear the people's complaints and to actively work with us to come up with a plan on how to change those things.
What are those specific complaints?
Tomorrow, I can't guarantee that we can address the complaints tomorrow. What my goal is to establish a timeline.
Are you okay? We're okay. We're okay. Just a spill of our photographer. We're okay, guys. We're okay, guys.
I'm glad you're okay.
I'm so glad you're okay.
We're so glad. We're so glad he's okay. We got the wave. He's
Yeah,
good.
part of the dangers of walking backwards in the middle of a protest. Kaylee, can you hear me still?
The timeline is very important.
Yes, Lindsay, I can hear you.
That's what we're demanding.
So Kaylee,
I can hear you.
okay, just one quick question before you go. Can you ask the protesters if those 3 other officers are arrested that are involved in the death of George Floyd, if they're arrested, will their protest stop or will they continue?
If our anchor, Lindsay Davis, wants to know, if the 3 other officers involved in George Floyd's death are arrested, will this stop?
No.
No, we will not stop until charges are filed, and we will not stop until we see true change in police reform.
Beyond that, George Floyd was the ignition. He was the fire of amazing coals of oppression that have been burning for so long. We won't stop until we have actual reform change in Seattle.
And that includes every other unarmed death of an innocent black man or woman of an officer who has not been charged. Those cases need to be finished. They need to be gone through. They need to be re-looked over, and that needs to happen as soon as possible.
We recognize that there are issues such as the badge numbers being covered. We recognize that and other things. I understand my cameraman looks kind of not okay.
I think we appreciate your time. We appreciate your efforts to get your message of peace to this crowd, and we'll be right here with you as this continues.
Thank you so much.
Lindsay.
Kaylee Hartung, thank you so much for your reporting. And now to Washington, where President Trump is taking heat after peaceful protesters were cleared away from the White House last night, all apparently so the president could have this moment, a photo op in front of a nearby church while holding up a Bible. You may recall the dramatic scene taking place around this same time last night. The president made another stop at a religious site today. ABC News Chief White House correspondent Jonathan Carl has the latest on the photo op firestorm.
As President Trump rode through Washington today, citizens, including families with homemade signs, jeered the presidential limousine. We were in the motorcade watching the people, their signs withering. Are you a moral monster? I can't breathe. Today, outrage is growing over the forceful removal of peaceful protesters to clear the way for the president to hold a photo op at St. John's Church. It all began shortly after 6 p.m., the hour before Washington's curfew took effect. The protesters had gathered just a block from the White House gate. As the president prepared to speak in the Rose Garden, our camera spotted Attorney General Bill Barr surveying the scene. Sources tell ABC News the Attorney General then gave the order to remove the protesters using force. And so it began, continuing even as the president was saying these words.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
You could hear the explosions from the Rose Garden, the police using flashbang, smoke canisters, and pepper balls to force the protesters away. Among those roughed up, an Australian TV crew, the photographer hit in the face, his colleague hit with a baton as she tried to flee. After he was done speaking, the president, accompanied by his top advisors, walked to St. John's Church, crossing the street where the protesters had gathered less than an hour earlier. In front of the church, the president held up a Bible.
Is that your Bible?
It's a Bible.
He summoned his advisors to pose for a photo before heading back to the White House. Among the first to express outrage, the Bishop of Washington, the spiritual leader of Episcopalians in the nation's capital, including the parishioners at St. John's.
But he is not entitled to use the spiritual symbolism of our sacred spaces and our sacred texts to promote or to justify a entirely different message.
The condemnation stretched across the political spectrum, including prominent Republicans.
If your question is, should you use tear gas to clear a path so the president can go have a photo op, the answer is no.
Republican Senator Ben Sasse said, quote, "I'm against clearing out a peaceful protest for a photo op that treats the word of God as a political prop." Even Pat Robertson, prominent televangelist and an ardent supporter of President Trump, had harsh words for the president.
And it seems like now is the time to say, I understand your pain. I want to comfort you. I think it's time we love each other. But the president took a different course.
Robertson lambasted the president for threatening to move military troops into American cities unless the nation's governors control the violence.
Matter of fact, he spoke of them as being jerks. You just don't do that, Mr. President. It isn't cool.
And Jonathan Karl joins us now live from the White House. John, explain what officials are saying as far as why the park was cleared last night ahead of the president's walk over to that church and whether or not tear gas was used.
Well, first of all, the park police, which was the main agency, there were several law enforcement agencies out there taking part in the clearing out of that area. But the lead on it was the park police. And the park police are saying that they used flashbang, smoke canisters, and pepper balls, but did not use tear gas. Now, obviously, the combination of smoke canisters, flashbang, and pepper balls is a quite forceful eviction, forceful tools used to evict the protesters there, but that is what they are saying. As far as the decision, there's been some conflicting information. We are told that Attorney General Barr, as you saw in my story, made that decision when he came here. What officials are saying is that it was actually a decision that had been made the day before, and when Barr got here and he saw that the whole area had not been cleared out, he said, do it and do it now. And of course, you saw it was done right away.
It certainly was. All right, Jonathan Karl from the White House tonight. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Lindsay.
And let's go now to Rachel Scott, who is live on the scene near Lafayette Park in Washington. Rachel, we are now well past the curfew time in Washington, D.C. Just describe the scene there. And are police making any moves to get people off the streets?
Well, this is the part of the night where things start to take a shift, Lindsay. If you take a look behind me, you can see there are still protesters gathering here in front of the White House. That is Lafayette Park. Just a few blocks up, there's a barrier set up. And some of the park police on the other side of that. Some of the protesters have either left or moved to a different area. Many are still here, but what we are seeing now is this clash between some protesters who are deciding to throw things over the fence there at park police and other protesters who are trying to self-police, encouraging people to stay calm and remain nonviolent. We're actually seeing right now that we're getting a little bit more of a police presence here. I just want to show you, we're seeing some park police arrive here. We're after the curfew now, and this is when you see some of the protesters making their way over here as well. We are way past the curfew here, but people say that it's important for their message to be heard. Yesterday, around this time, we were seeing arrests. We were actually walking with protesters that decided to stay in the area. Police were lined up on both sides as they are tonight, and they closed in and they decided to arrest some of the protesters that were defying that curfew. So far, I have not seen any arrests in this area, but I am seeing an increased police presence here. That barrier between the White House gates and Lafayette Park and the protesters seems to be helping a little bit with the tense clashes that we saw yesterday. This was a totally different scene playing out. I also just want to take note here, Lindsay, that parts of this section of D.C. were on fire over the last couple of days. You can see that some of the windows here are boarded up. This building on my left right here went up in flames just a few nights ago. And so this has really been the area that has seen a lot of those tense and violent clashes here. Most of the protesters here say they want to send this message peacefully. Thousands were marching to the White House today, but this is the part of the night where typically we have seen things take a turn, Lindsay.
And so obviously you've just stated that there's quite a difference between the clashes of yesterday and now what you're seeing today. But does it seem that protesters are still out and about in the same intensity, or is that tapering off?
I would say even more so, Lindsay. I think yesterday the president's response and his handling of this got them even more fired up. We saw thousands of people walk down these streets straight up to the White House today, chanting in unison, kneeling down. There were thousands of people taking a knee right here in honor of George Floyd. It was a powerful moment. When you're in the nation's capital, an area, right, where behind us, the White House was built by slaves. You had the March on Washington here, and you see these moments unfold, right? This next generation of protesters believes that they are the ones to pick up that torch and carry that on. If anything, yesterday just provided them more fuel. They wanted to be out here again. They said they are not going away until justice is served. And that was the message that they were trying to get across. Now, the question is whether a lot of them maybe have left as of right now, as this curfew has come down. It was set for 7 p.m. They may have already left, but clearly they still wanted to send that message here today, Lindsay, and they really did have a strong turnout, thousands of people here.
And until justice is served, it'll be interesting to see what that means for so many of these protesters. Rachel Scott, thank you again for your reporting. We appreciate it. May check in with you later on the end of this program. Thank you again. And now let's go to Matt Gutman. I think, do we have Matt in L.A.?
You have Matt.
Matt,
hey,
I can hear you, but okay, now I see you and I hear you. So I heard that there are some pretty powerful scenes taking place there between police and protesters. Tell us about that.
It's been an incredible moment, so let me just set the scene for you, Lindsay. We are right outside the mayor's house. That is Mayor Eric Garcetti's house here in Hancock Park, one of the most affluent enclaves, not just in L.A., but possibly the country. And right behind us is, I guess, a skirmish line, a standoff between police and protesters. It is past curfew by about 25 minutes, but there is a noticeable difference in the way police have been dealing with protesters today. We've been marching all day. There are tens of thousands of protesters that have been marching throughout the city and basically converging here at the mayor's house about an hour ago, staging this protest, but police have basically let them go wherever they wanted to go. We have not seen a single instance, I haven't, of vandalism or violence. Right now you can hear them chanting behind us. There's a line of police you can't see beyond where those banners are. If a cameraman Lenny can maybe raise the camera a little bit, you might be able to see something. And just a few minutes ago, despite this being curfew, the commander here, who is the top-ranking police officer in this area, took off his helmet and started walking with protesters right down to the next street, arm in arm. Eventually, he took a knee along with protesters when he got to Wilshire Boulevard, another street. Everybody began cheering. The two of them hugged. It was an incredibly touching moment, and one that, despite having marched, I don't know, 25, 24 miles over the past several days with protesters and been all over the city, I have not seen any engagement of that kind between police and protesters, and it started to happen now. And I talked to the commander afterwards and to the protesters, and they're saying this is the change that we're talking about. We're trying to make it one step at a time, and we're all learning as we go right now. This is a learning process for everybody, Lindsay.
And so you say that you've gone probably the equivalent, I guess, of a marathon at this point on foot with the protesters. You say that this is a learning time. What have you learned, Matt?
I have learned a lot. I have learned to listen. I have learned to be aware of the crowd, and I've learned that the crowd itself has gotten more peaceful as they've gone along. It's so interesting. It's like the vandals have melted away. We have seen a lot of spray painting, a lot of breaking of windows, and that has melted away. More of LA has come out to support this. An incredibly mixed crowd today. And I've learned that there is power in numbers. People have come out, and despite thinking that it really wouldn't happen, I think police are listening, which, is surprising. Is this change going to last? We have no idea. What is going to happen tomorrow? We don't, honestly, I have no, reporter radar that can tell me everything here that we're dealing with is new right now. but it feels a little bit different right now. And for the first time in a few days, at the very least, I can tell you that feels good for me, for some of the protesters, maybe even some of the police as well, Lindsay.
And listening may be just the first step, right? Because I think that a lot of the protesters, they just want to be heard. Matt Gutman, thank you so much. Joining us now is Oklahoma Republican Senator James Lankford. Thank you so much for your time, Senator.
No, thank you.
So let's go back 24 hours. A peaceful group of demonstrators were in Lafayette Park next to the White House. As a result of President Trump's brief photo op in front of St. John's Church, authorities used an irritant similar to tear gas to clear out the square. What's your response to that?
Yeah, surprising on it. Obviously, the people are gathering peacefully to be able to protest. The president, I wish he would have gone and visit that same church early in the morning after the fire that had happened there the night before, and 60 Secret Service members had been injured in the protest that had happened the night before by people throwing things at them. I mean, it's entirely reasonable for the president to be able to step out. I just wish he'd done it in the morning rather than at a time when there would have been people there and they were trying to be able to clear a crowd. People need the ability to be able to protest publicly. I think it's why you see such a large crowd there tonight. You can't tell Americans you can't do something. If you tell Americans you can't be here, you can't protest, you'll have 10 times as many show up the next time because we know constitutionally we're allowed to do that.
Do you have any understanding why the president went there? I mean, typically people would go to a church for a service or to pray and not to merely take a picture.
Right. No, I've not talked to the president about that. I would assume it's because just a couple of days before that church had been burned, that church had been vandalized. That's a historic church for Washington, D.C. And I think it's a statement of, hey, we're not going to allow the people that are going to destroy to be able to take this away. The difficulty I have is the president just given a really good speech about unity, about gathering together, about honoring George Floyd, about trying to be able to speak out for law and order in every community and say the protesters are not all doing this. This is a select few, and they need to know they're going to face consequences of the law, as they should. And then I think him walking across the street distracted from the good message that he had just given at the Rose Garden.
The president has threatened to deploy active military throughout the country to help calm down the protesters. A few hours ago, Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs under President Obama and George W. Bush, said in an op-ed in The Atlantic, our fellow citizens are not the enemy and must never become so. Do you think that the president should be threatening to deploy active military who have not been trained to defuse protests?
Well, I would leave that decision up to the president and what needs to happen on that level. I would tell you there's 17,000 National Guard that have been activated in 23 different states. The National Guard had been a tremendous resource to our local law enforcement and assistance to the local law enforcement. Military is not a law enforcement arm. National Guard supports what happens in all of our states, and in every community where the National Guard has come out, they've been a help to local law enforcement. So I think that's where I would prioritize are the men and women that are in National Guard and the work that they're doing to be able to help our law enforcement. I do think we need to continue to pay attention to not only what was happening in front of St. John's last night, but 4 police officers that were shot in St. Louis, 2 police officers that were run over in a vehicle in New York. We had 60 Secret Service members that were injured 2 nights before. So trying to be able to provide water rather than gasoline to all of this dialogue and to do what we're trying to do today. Today is Blackout Tuesday, to maintain real dialogue with everyone and to be able to say, what can we do to listen to each other is much better than trying to inflame anybody for anything on either side.
And demonstrators are now considering a sit-in at the U.S. Capitol building tomorrow. Would you consider joining them? And also, what bipartisan steps do you think that Congress needs to take at this point to help address some of the protesters' concerns?
Well, I don't know that I would consider sitting in all day tomorrow. Obviously, I was participating in the Blackout Tuesday today. But I would tell you, obviously, all of us have got work to be able to do. We have a tremendous amount. That's why the Senate is in session all of this week, because we have quite a bit that we've got to be able to cover for the nation, both in this issue, in COVID-19, and a lot of foreign policy issues and nominations and things. We've got through the Inspector General for the COVID-19 work now. And so there's a lot we still have to be able to do. But I would say there is a lot of bipartisan conversation right now. And the first thing that we can do is listen, is slow down to be able to make sure and find out what has been missed in this that we've got to be able to engage, and then to be able to reinforce the voices in my own community from Oklahoma and from around the country to make sure that we're addressing the issues. There is no one single item that solves all of this. There are issues all across our country in multiple ways. While we've made a lot of progress in race relations in the last 100 years, we still have a ways to go. And for those individuals that say, no, we're done with race relations in America, everything's finished, I would repeat to them over and over again, we are not done. And there's a lot that still needs to be done. And that's one of the things that we can bring to this is repeating those voices from at home and make sure we're amplifying what they need.
You previously directed a youth ministry. Do you think if you had the opportunity to have the president's ear, do you think that his reaction is the right response? And as a man of faith, what do you think, if again, you had that moment to talk to the president, to perhaps give him some suggestion as far as healing and moving forward in this country, what that might be?
Well, I quite frankly go back to Micah 6:8 is the passage that says, what does the Lord require of us? And that is to act justly, which we desperately need justice right now, love mercy, and to walk humbly. Those three things are desperately needed right now. We need justice, we need mercy for people in the situations that they're in, and we need people to walk humbly. So that's something that can increase our conversation. It's a biblical principle, but it's something that we can continue to do. And if I want to bring it up to even the civil rights from 50 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Said often, darkness doesn't drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate doesn't drive out hate, only love can do that. So this most basic principle that is both a scriptural principle and a great principle for our society is, if we want to be able to drive out hate in our culture, you don't just add more hate to it, that just increases the volume. If you want to decrease the volume and increase the conversation, you've got to pour love onto the top of hate. That actually does that. Again, the biblical principle is a gentle answer turns away wrath. We need more gentle answers at this point, and more conversation with families and individuals.
And just want to talk for a second about the annual legislative report card from last Congress. The NAACP gave you an F, saying that you voted for the organization's civil rights priorities 9% of the time. You were one of the 114 GOP members who voted against more than 90% of the NAACP's priorities. As well are aware, sadly, that this is not a new problem. Why haven't you and your colleagues engaged more with the NAACP in the past?
So I appreciate you trying to bring something up to try to show that I'm not for racial reconciliation in a moment when we're trying to talk about racial reconciliation. I don't know what was on the NAACP scorecard. It could have been a lot of issues that are not race related. And I hope you're not implying that I haven't worked on the race relations issues when I most certainly have my entire ministry before I came into Congress, and certainly in the time I've been in Congress. So I hope there's not some secret implication that you're trying to be able to spin on Republicans on that. The fact is, I don't know what's on their scorecard. Everyone puts out a different scorecard on different issues. My focus has been on what can we do to be able to establish better relationships with people. I've shown that in my actions and in my words, and how I voted over and over again. So I'll look forward to getting a chance to see that scorecard and to see if there's anything race related on it. But I would tell you, I was an outspoken advocate for the Second Chance bill. That was a major priority, not only of the NAACP, but of mine as well. That actually became law. I was a part of it, worked through that with Cory Booker, where we both had a section we were trying to be able to get done. So there's a lot that we can do. And what I'd recommend to you and to others is, let's not find ways to divide each other and try to be able to plant different things to be able to divide. Let's do what we should do for all of America. Let's find ways to unite and to say, what are we doing going forward, and how do we solve this, looking at our past and looking forward and listening.
Senator, there is nothing about this that is an attempt to be divisive. These are facts. This is what the NAACP said. This is the rating that they gave you. I was simply giving you a chance to react to them giving you an F. But I'll move on. Last question to you, if you don't mind. You repeatedly said that Americans need to engage with people who are different, even invite them over for dinner. So should the president meet with the protesters who are outside of the White House right now, and what would you advise him to say to them?
Yeah, I would absolutely encourage them to do this. This is something I've done for years now, is I've said to people a very simple statement. Has your family ever invited a family of another race to your home for dinner? Because I find oftentimes people of all races will say to me, I have friends of another race, but there's never been someone from another race in my home for a meal. To me, that breaks down the barriers. It's one of the most basic things that we find is that we're friendly with people of another race, but not developing friendships. And so for me, one of the challenges that I put in front of people of all races, and I have for years, is to be able to say, what are you doing to develop friendships with people? And that begins most often by inviting someone to your home for a meal to be able to sit down together. So I'd certainly recommend that for the president as well, to be able to have any group of leaders to be able to sit down and have a long conversation. Again, a national conversation about race is not about elected political officials with cameras all around them around a big conference table. That's not a national conversation on race. A national conversation on race happens at dinner tables all across America, because race is not a legislative issue. Race and racism is a heart issue, and it's a family issue, and it gets passed on through a family, and it only gets solved when families sit down and talk about it as a family, and when you get to know families that are of different ethnicity, and so you can get a chance to be able to develop real friendships and to be able to break down those barriers. So that's a long-term solution that starts one family at a time to be able to have a national conversation on race.
National conversation. Thank you for joining this conversation here tonight, Senator Lankford. We appreciate it. Taking a live look now in New York City, where you still see protesters out in large numbers. Quite a police presence as well. We are now past the curfew. People are supposed to be off of the streets now for several hours, back in their homes. They are not. At the same time, we don't see any confrontation. It looks like, well, actually, is this Boston right here? Now we're looking at Boston, home of the Boston Tea Party. This area is familiar with protests. Here we see some protesters there with their hands up. They appear to be throwing some things in the direction of the police officers. Some tense moments continue building here in Boston. And now it has been lost amid all the other news, but there are elections in 9 states and Washington, D.C. tonight. Voting tonight is a lot more complicated amid the pandemic and widespread protests gripping the country. These are all primary elections, including for the presidential primary, even though it's just about over. And after weeks out of the spotlight, the presumptive nominee, former Vice President Joe Biden, formally responded to President Trump's handling of the unrest gripping the nation. The presumptive Democratic nominee saying in an address from Philadelphia's City Hall that the president is dividing the country and that he would not, quote, fan the flames of hate if elected. Here's ABC's Mary Bruce.
Tonight, the tale of two leaders, the president and the man who wants to replace him. President Trump holding that Bible, Joe Biden visiting a church. Tonight, Biden taking on the president.
A country is crying out for leadership. Leadership that can recognize pain and deep grief of communities that have had a knee on their neck for a long time.
Biden calling on leaders to confront systemic racism and blasting Trump for that Bible photo op.
I just wish he opened it once in a while instead of brandishing it. If he opened it, he could have learned something.
Biden speaking of his own loss, a parent losing a son.
I know what it means to have that black hole in your chest where your grief is being sucked into it.
Tonight, Biden is calling on Congress to ban chokeholds and vowing to establish a national police oversight commission.
Donald Trump has turned this country into a battlefield riven by old resentments and fresh fears. He thinks division helps him. His narcissism has become more important than the nation's well-being that he leads.
And Biden's promise less than 6 months from the election.
I promise you this. I won't traffic in fear and division. I won't fan the flames of hate. I'll seek to heal the racial wounds that have long plagued our country, not use them for political gain.
Mary Bruce joins us now. Mary, the vice president has been constrained in campaigning because of coronavirus, of course, but does this speech signal a shift at all in the campaign strategy to more directly take on the president and to be out in public more?
Yeah, Lindsay, this was actually his first major public address in months. He has been largely behind closed doors, following guidelines not to be out in public meeting with voters. But as the country begins to open up, I'm told we can expect to see a lot more of Joe Biden, especially as he looks to draw these sharp contrasts with President Trump. And his campaign is defending themselves, dismissing criticism of their decision to lay low these past few weeks. They say, just look at the poll numbers, which now show Joe Biden is on the rise. Lindsay.
And how's the president and also his campaign responding to Biden's remarks?
Yeah, no surprise here. The Trump campaign was quick to put out their own fiery statement in response. They are accusing the former vice president of making, quote, the crass political calculation that unrest in America is a benefit to his candidacy. I suspect we are going to see a lot of feisty statements between the two campaigns over this subject matter, Lindsay.
To be sure. Okay, Mary Bruce joining us from the nation's capital. Thanks, Mary. And we move now to Minneapolis, where this current crisis started. One of the key demands from the Floyd family and the thousands taking the streets is accountability for the officers involved in George Floyd's death. And tonight, as those calls grow, the state of Minnesota is launching another investigation into its own police department. Alex Perez is in Minneapolis with the latest.
Tonight, with demands for more arrest in the George Floyd case growing, the family attorney claiming charges against the other officers may be imminent.
You understand, they will be charged. That is what the family is hearing from the authorities.
The state's attorney general asked how soon we could see charges.
Very soon, but again, I'm working on this case with a team, and they're telling me, hey, look, we're doing this as fast as we can.
The autopsy commissioned by Floyd's family found it was a homicide and that the other officers seen in this video restraining Floyd may have contributed to his death.
The weight of the other two police officers on his back, who not only prevented blood flow into his brain, but also airflow into his lungs.
The official medical examiner's autopsy also found it was a homicide, but said there was something else at play as well, pointing to cardiopulmonary arrest that was complicated by law enforcement restraint and neck compression. But the experts hired by Floyd's family disagree.
The autopsy shows that Mr. Floyd had no underlying medical problem that caused or contributed to his death. He was in good health.
And the governor here has announced the state's Department of Human Rights has launched an investigation into the practices and policies of the Minneapolis Police Department. Alex Perez, ABC News, Minneapolis.
Our thanks to Alex. And we go now to stunning scenes from Houston, Texas, George Floyd's hometown. Thousands marched through the downtown streets, chants of peace, moments of silence, fists in the air. City officials were there in support, and so were Floyd's friends and family. ABC's Marcus Moore is also in Houston tonight.
In Houston tonight, a sea of humanity and a wave of emotion. Hope that healing can begin.
We want justice for Floyd, and I'm a black mother, and I heard this cry, and it hurt me to my heart.
Tens of thousands marching across the city in memory of George Floyd.
I just feel like there's something powerful going on right now, something that should have been done a long time ago.
The crowd has doubled in size at least since I last talked to you.
The march, supported by city officials and organized with help from local rappers Bun B and Trey the Truth. Truth, a longtime friend of Floyd.
It's a beautiful moment. We're making George proud. This is George's family here. We're making them proud to show how many people love George.
This scene coming a day after Floyd's brother Terrence visited the Minneapolis intersection where George Floyd took his last breath.
I need you and Pops to watch over me.
Floyd died May 25th. He'd worked in Minnesota as a security guard, but he was a child of Houston's 3rd Ward, where a new mural now bears his image and reads, "Forever breathing in our hearts." He was a star tight end on the Yates High School football team, and he was a father to 6-year-old Gianna.
I want justice for him because he was good, and this is the proof that he was a good man.
There are services this week in Minneapolis and North Carolina. Floyd's funeral is set for Tuesday here in Houston, and a family attorney says Vice President Joe Biden is expected to attend. Marcus Moore, ABC News, Houston.
Our thanks to Marcus, and we'll be back in a moment with more live coverage. We're going to head to the West Coast for a look at what's happening in the Bay Area. The mayor of San Francisco joins us next. And of course, all of this unrest taking place while the pandemic continues to rage. We continue to monitor that global crisis as well. And we take a look at Chicago. Earlier, protesters outside Wrigley Field. We'll be right back.
I worry terribly about the peaceful protests. I see some wearing masks. I see some others not wearing masks. And so we are really trying to work with each of the mayors to expand testing availability over the next week or two so that the individuals who are involved in the peaceful protests can get tested and really know their status before they unknowingly spread it to the elderly.
And that was the head of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, Dr. Deborah Birx, expressing concern that the protests that we're seeing might spread the outbreak. It is a concern that we will, of course, continue to monitor and be on top of. And now let's move to Marin County, California. The county saw protests like we've seen across the country, but with one major difference. The crowd was mostly white. Our Will Carr just filed this report for us.
Lindsay, we're in Marin County, which is just north of the Bay Area here in California, and what we have seen today is really juxtaposed what we have seen over the past couple days in Oakland and in San Francisco. We have seen a protest that had thousands of members of Marin County come out. This is a largely white county. The demographics are about 80% white, and this crowd has really represented those demographics. A lot of white residents have come out showing their message of unity after everything that we've seen over the past week that has come after George Floyd's death. Now, you can see people are not really physically distancing. A couple members of the crowd told us they are worried about that during a pandemic, but they told us that the message that they want to send to the rest of the country is far more important right now. Take a listen to a couple of the protesters we spoke with.
I really hope that people are educating themselves or having difficult conversations, and that this inspires them, as it is us and it is many people that we know, to seriously reevaluate the way that they relate to their identity, the way that they relate to whiteness, and all of this being done in an effort to be a more compassionate and empathetic ally.
It's everything that I thought it would be. You can feel the energy. It's really special. Marin County is really small, so I see a lot of people that I know. And I think that shows like the sense of community that we have here.
And in a big show of unity at this event, there was a protester who actually had a medical incident, and the speakers asked for the sheriff's department to come in and to help. They actually spread the sea of people here. They allowed the sheriff's deputies to go in. They got the paramedics here to help that protester out. It was a moment that just showed that everybody here was sort of coming together for one moment through all the tragedy and all the violence that we've seen over the past week. Lindsay.
Will Carr, our thanks to you. And now to San Francisco, one of many major American cities now imposing curfews after instances of looting and vandalism over the weekend. But protests have largely remained peaceful there. Yesterday on the steps of City Hall, Jamie Foxx joined local leaders by staging a kneel-in to protest George Floyd's death. Fox's star power certainly drew a lot of attention, but perhaps the most powerful moments of the day came when San Francisco Mayor London Breed spoke about how her own cousin was killed by the San Francisco Police Department. Breed also had a message for people trying to use the unrest as a wedge to divide. Take a listen.
Black Lives Matter is nobody's joke. I'm tired of people treating it that way. I'm tired of people masking their racism in Black Lives Matter. It is not a joke. It is not a joke.
Joining us now is Mayor London Breed. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start by expanding upon that. Tell us more about the ways that you've seen the message of these protests get twisted or turned into a joke.
Well, the problem I have, for example, the other evening, there were white protesters who came to my house with torches of fire, the fireworks, setting off fireworks and calling me kind of names that were disrespectful while chanting Black Lives Matter. Pulling on my gate, telling me to come outside. And the thing that bothered me the most about it, I mean, people, I understand, rightfully so, should protest, but it reminded me of what the KKK would do to African Americans when they would come to their homes, set their homes on fire, pull them out of their homes, and sometimes lynch people, African Americans. And the fact that you would come to the Black mayor's home and do this and not realize how racist this is, chanting Black Lives Matter, it's disrespectful to the movement. It's disrespectful to Black people who unfortunately have suffered in this country and all too often have experienced the pain that finally others are waking up to and seeing for themselves. This is what has infuriated me, because this pain that you see so many protesters that really are hurt and mad and frustrated and have had to live through their entire lives, this is a boiling point. And now the rest of the country is finally waking up to what Black people feel on a daily basis. And that's why I said this is not a joke. This is serious. This is hurtful. So if you're coming out in the spirit of love and in the spirit of supporting and seeing Black people the same way you see your mother, your aunt, your cousin, your son, and you care about making sure that the injustices that have happened to Black people in this country, especially at the hands of law enforcement, doesn't continue to happen, we support that. But you're not going to get away with this racism, this disrespect, and thinking that you're promoting this movement.
Just today, the San Francisco DA announced a resolution to prohibit the hiring of police officers with previous records of misconduct. I mean, that almost seems surprising that policies like that aren't already in place. What other types of police reforms are needed right now?
I think the thing that we've been doing here in San Francisco, the anti-bias training, there are a number of recommendations that we have from the Department of Justice when Obama was president that we are trying to implement. And what people have said, well, we're not implementing those recommendations fast enough, because every time there's an officer-involved shooting, people go back to the policies and the procedures and what they were taught, right? And ultimately, many of the recommendations that we have on the books, they need to be embedded in the culture of the department. People need to understand and get it, not just be told what the new procedures are, but we need to implement the recommendations that we already have on the books, which will help prevent a lot of the challenges that we see happening with law enforcement all over the country. And because of that work, there have been a number of situations where time and distance, where we have actually, there have been standoffs with the police officers, and the police officers went home safely, and the person who was a problem in some instance where there was a standoff, they went home safely. And the fact is, we have to be prepared to be patient, to work out the policies that we have. They don't have what we have in San Francisco on the books in all other cities. There has to be some sort of universal principle here around protecting life at all costs, but there also has to be accountability. So when you have a situation like what happened to George Floyd, where you are on his neck, and the fact that no other police officer thought that was a problem, that is where the problem is. That should never be the case. And so I think it's, of course, changes to policies and procedures, but it's also accountability. They have to be held accountable. And firing in this particular case is not enough. They were standing right there and they did nothing. So they are just as guilty as the person who put his knee on George's neck.
How would you say that the recent curfews have helped keep the peace in San Francisco? And what is the plan going forward with regard to lifting that curfew?
I think what we're doing right now is we're looking at extending the curfew's time to a later time period. We're looking at, the goal is we want people to come out. We want them to peacefully protest. This is not, and people have said these protests are about protecting property and vandalism. And so this is about protecting people. This is about making sure that when folks are throwing Molotov cocktails into a crowd full of people, that someone armed doesn't get blown off. Like, this is about protecting people and making sure that the protesters and the officers and everyone who's out on the ground goes home safely. And my goal is to protect the public. And so we are not certain as to when the curfews will be lifted, but I would like to lift them as soon as we possibly can.
And last time when we spoke, it was about your city's response to the coronavirus outbreak. How is San Francisco doing now? And how has the pandemic made things different from as far as when it comes to the outrage that many are feeling and the unrest that the country is experiencing?
Yeah, it's tough because we're asking people to socially distance, wear a mask, and stay at home. But you know what? People are feeling hurt and they want to express themselves. Yesterday at City Hall, when we had this rally, like, people were close to me and close to everyone else. The last thing on your mind is worrying about whether or not you're going to get infected. People had on masks, but you're upset. There's a lot of emotion going on here. So it's really hard to get people to comply. But we understand the importance. We see the curve decreasing in San Francisco, and that's good news. We don't want to go backwards. We have testing capabilities. We have capacity in our hospitals, but we definitely don't want to see it go backwards. But we also think it's so important that people are able to come together and express themselves and to just express outrage for what is happening all over the country. We want change, and people are making it clear this time around that we are not going to back down. This is not something that people are going to walk away from easily, because we need to see change. And unfortunately, it's happening during COVID-19, but it's been a really tough balance.
Mayor London Breed, thank you so much again for coming on the show. It's been a fortunate experience to be able to hear from you again.
Thank you.
And we still have a lot more to get to here on ABC News Prime. What did China know and when about the spread of the coronavirus? Some are accusing them of a cover-up. And we drilled down on the number of police-involved shootings. Some are findings that might surprise you. But first, our posts of the day. The blackout leading to so many staying off social media. Welcome back. With thousands now taking to the streets to protest George Floyd's death, we wanted to take a step back and look at policing in America and its intersection with race by the numbers. 1,099 people nationwide were killed by the police last year, according to the Mapping Police Violence database. Black Americans were 24% of those killed, despite being only 13% of the population. Let's say it another way. A black person was 3 times more likely to be killed by police than a white person. 1 in 3 black people killed by police, they were unarmed in 2015, according to one study. Sadly, various data suggest that nationally there are as many police killings today as there were before Michael Brown's death in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, which sparked widespread protests. But this surprised us. Police shootings have dropped significantly by 37% in America's 30 largest cities since 2013, while they've substantially increased in suburban and rural areas, according to an analysis by 538. This mirrors another shift in the criminal justice system. The number of people jailed per capita has fallen by 22% in urban areas and increased by 26% in rural areas since 2013, according to the Vera Institute. Some experts say that the drop in police shootings in cities like Philadelphia, San Francisco, Baltimore, and Chicago suggests that reforms in their police use of force policies are working. And still ahead, our conversation with the former head of Chicago's police department. How can trust be restored between law enforcement and all communities? But first, here's some of the trending stories on abcnews.com.
A sign of inspiration, the community building this mural of George Floyd.
You can come here and cry. You can come here and pray.
Leaders pushing for that same peace across the country. From New York.
On the protesters, they're outraged. And by the way, I agree with them.
To Richmond, Virginia.
It's commit to you that such a thing will never happen again.
Yesterday, once the sun went down, the situation turning violent. There was looting once again in New York City, some breaking into Macy's at Herald Square. In Las Vegas, 2 officers were shot during protests, and an NYPD officer seen in this surveillance video hit by a driver in the Bronx that kept going. Police are reviewing the video as part of their investigation.
Attorney General William Barr personally ordered law enforcement officials on the ground last night to clear out the peaceful protesters near the White House so President Trump and his aides could go to St. John's Church for a photo op. That today from a Justice Department official to ABC News.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi holding up a Bible, reading verses of healing and denouncing President Trump.
But we would hope that the President of the United States would follow the lead of so many other presidents before him to be a healer in chief and not a fanner of the flame.
Today, President Trump and the First Lady visiting a Catholic shrine to St. John Paul II in Washington. D.C.'s Catholic Archbishop Wilton Gregory condemning the second religious visit as a publicity stunt, calling it baffling and reprehensible.
A new push to determine the origins of COVID-19. The Associated Press reports that China waited more than a week to release the genetic map of the virus in order to control the information.
China would welcome an international review into the origins of the pandemic. That's according to Beijing's ambassador to the UK.
There's no cover-up. There's no delay. China's record is clean.
Says the WHO should lead such a review led by scientists and free of politics.
Well, if you follow the popular Netflix series Tiger King, you know who Carol Baskin is. And it turns out her story continues. Baskin, who runs a Florida Big Cat Zoo, won a major victory in court against her arch nemesis, Joe Exotic. The court gave Baskin control of the 16-acre Big Cat Zoo he used to own in Oklahoma. Joe Exotic, whose real name is Joseph Allen Maldonado Passage, remains in prison for his attempt to hire a hitman to kill Baskin. An attorney for Jeff Lowe, who currently owns Joe Exotic's park, said he is not filing an appeal.
And some breaking news to pass along. In a series of tweets, President Trump announced that he is now seeking another venue for the Republican National Convention and that it will no longer be held in North Carolina. Earlier today, the governor of North Carolina denied a request from the RNC for a full convention given the current pandemic. The president tweeted that because the governor refused to guarantee access to the arena as originally anticipated, the GOP will now look for another state to host its 2020 convention. And let's go back to New York City, where the curfew has been in effect since 8 p.m. Eastern time. Police are shutting down most traffic south of 96th Street in Manhattan. Our Stephanie Ramos is still on the streets of New York City. Stephanie, what are you seeing and hearing?
Well, Lindsay, right now it is pretty deserted across this area. I've seen 1 or 2 groups walking by. We've seen every couple of minutes NYPD vehicles it was pretty much speeding down the street here. They're probably headed downtown. That's where we're seeing larger groups of people in the Times Square area. We've got aerial pictures of that. That's where they're gathering. And as you know, that curfew is in place across New York City, that 8 o'clock curfew. Last night it was 11 o'clock. They pushed it up a couple of hours for police hoping that it helps prevent some of the break-ins and the looting that we've seen the last couple of days. The mayor also banning rideshare services like Uber, Lyft, and Via, saying that those services were being used by some of these agitators to go across the city and loot. So he says that a series of tactical moves, he says, have been put in place across the city tonight. Things that they, kind of correcting what moves they made the last 48 hours. They don't want to see a repeat, basically, of what they saw last night.
And so far, so good. It looks like they have accomplished that mission. Still, protesters not necessarily listening to the curfew, but it appears peaceful. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your reporting. Americans have been out in force protesting the nation's capital. A surge of residents marching to the Lincoln Memorial earlier this evening. The steps there lined with National Guard troops. ABC's Rachel Scott has been there on the streets talking with protesters, many of them young people, on what's motivating them as the nation grapples with the killing of George Floyd and a legacy of racial injustice.
Tonight, a young rage is rippling across the nation. Part of this
movement a new generation of voices driven by diverse faces and allies. Across the country, these are the faces stepping in to fight for change. 23-year-old Ariana Evans told me it's her first time protesting, though you wouldn't know it from the way she commands a crowd.
We are the people. We are the power. Without us, there is no you. Without our money.
She says the outcry heard across the nation is years in the making.
Nothing has changed. Eric Garner, Sandra Bland. Why? This continual abuse of power is not going to stand with us. And as long as we keep fighting against each other, we're never going to get anywhere. And I think that our generation especially understands that.
An 18-year-old today would have been in 4th grade when Trayvon Martin was killed, 7th grade when Tamir Rice was killed by police in Cleveland, and just entering high school when Philando Castile was shot by police in 2016.
7 years ago when we said Black Lives Matter, people were saying, why? People were questioning, we have a black president. Why do we need to say that? There was a real binary between Black Lives Matter and all lives matter. And now people get it. People get that when black communities are suffering, it means that we're all suffering.
Outside a White House built by slaves, chants of Black Lives Matter.
Justice! Now!
The images of today's protests reminiscent of the civil rights era. More than 50 years later, young Americans still pushing for racial equality.
We want institutional change. We want this whole system torn down. We want police to have better training. We want them to actually follow their guidelines for force. We want them to do their jobs, to protect and serve us. We want to be economically equal. That's all. That is all we want.
I met blind activist Justice Shorter, who said that change will only come when everyone takes a stand.
We're being killed every single day, and it won't stop unless we do something to stop it. We're dealing with a flood of frustration and fury, and it will not end until there is some sustainable change in this country.
Today, as the president visited a Catholic shrine, a large crowd of protesters gathered outside, silent until the president's motorcade drove past. What message do you want to send to the president today?
That the kids are watching and they need to know that the world can be a fair place, and he's really making it hard for kids to see that. They hear everything. They're sponges, and he's making the world a much worse place, and we want her to fight back.
Can you tell us about the sign? Can you tell us what you did?
I made the sign so Donald Trump could know that he can't be mean. He can't be mean.
And how old are you?
4 years old.
You're 4 years old, and you think it's important to be here today. You wanted to be here. I spoke with Tracy Leapart on why she believes it's so important to have her children at these demonstrations. How do you talk about this between you two and then also with a 5-year-old as well?
So he's quite aware of what's been going on. He's not totally shielded as to what's going on. He's not seeing the extensive videos, but he is aware of what happened in Central Park. He's aware of what that. She's about to graduate from high school, so she more than ever needs to see what the world really looks like and how her footing matters and how her words matter.
All my life, I've kind of seen police brutality. I was killed. I was probably in 6th grade or so. So I just remember events like that. And I think that now more than ever, it's most important now that people are standing up.
I'm a parent of 2 brown children, and everything that's happened in the last couple of weeks has totally resonated. Everything that's happened since 1619 has resonated. So it's trying to show them that we can demonstrate and protest and collectively join without any violence.
And Rachel Scott joins us again now live. Rachel, really powerful to see that the young people who are out there protesting, many of them just were in the 4th or 5th grade when Trayvon Martin was killed. Give us a sense of what you're seeing out on the street right now.
Lindsay, in 5 days of protest, this is the quietest that we have seen this street at this time. If you look just behind me, you can see the White House there. We're just a few blocks away. But in just a few days ago, sections of this street were on fire. St. John's Church, where the president stopped yesterday, is just right there. That was lit up in flames earlier this week. That's also where we saw some of the tense clashes here with police and protesters. There was a really organized effort in the beginning of the day to have thousands of people march right here to the White House to deliver a message to President Trump. It was a peaceful protest. We saw thousands of people on one knee chanting George Floyd, demanding for justice. Now we are seeing protesters split up. We just saw some protesters walk down that street down there, heading somewhere else. We still see some back here. We're also seeing some protesters starting to throw some bottles and other objects over the fence that they have set up as a barrier between the White House and the White House gates and the protesters. And so this is where things have started to take a turn typically in the middle of the night as the curfew, we're way past curfew now, and as the night gets extended. But so far in this section, all is quiet. Still some peaceful protests going on behind me from what we can tell. No major arrests, but definitely a large police presence here tonight. Lindsay.
Rachel Scott, thank you for your reporting once again. And grappling with race and racism in America, it is hard enough for adults, but it can be so much more daunting when it comes to children. Dr. Donald Grant, a psychologist, author, and the executive director of Mindful Training Solutions, says if you have children older than 4, it's time to talk to them about race. He joins us now to explain. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So black parents talk to their children about race quite often, you know, when kids are rather young. But you say that white parents also need to have the conversation. What's the first step?
Well, first step is recognizing the humanity in your children's friends and understanding that if you want them to live through adulthood, it's an important conversation that you have to have. And so I think that's the first key in understanding that as uncomfortable as our white community members may be discussing race, it has to happen because that discussion can certainly save my son's life into the future. One of the next steps to that is making sure that they're dealing with their own kind of internal concerns as it relates to their racial identity. I think that's one of the biggest concerns. You hear people say white privilege, and it really, really tenses white folk up. But the reality is that it's real in the same way that male privilege is real and Christian privilege and heterosexual privilege. And until we master those things, it's going to be really tough to be effective with our children. But those are two of the first major steps. And then educating themselves, finding books, not always asking black folk to explain, but really digging in and doing research and understanding that Google has a second page that you can go to for additional stuff. I think it's really important.
Now, you say that 5 and up is the right age. 5 seems so young, and it also seems like it has the potential to rob a child of the carefree, the innocent aspect of childhood. Why is it so necessary, in your opinion, to have these conversations so early?
That's such a great point. So many people bring that point up. And unfortunately, black children don't have the luxury of not being robbed of that innocence. And so the more we can help children of white families understand that and move through it, research demonstrates that the age of 4, children begin to engage in exclusionary practices based on race. There's a wonderful book called The First Hour of Racism. That's a study that shows how children in preschool begin to use racial attributes, to make determinations on who they'll be friends with, who they want to take a nap next to, who they'll eat lunch with. And so just because parents are not talking about race at that early age, it doesn't mean that your children are not actively acting upon racial constructs, because the world is telling them about race, even if you aren't.
At 4 years old, so young. But what do you recommend that we say to children who are seeing these images of protests on TV, or maybe even experiencing them in real life?
Yeah, it's developmental, right? And so I remember early on in some of the early protests, my son is 10 now, but at this time he was maybe 5, and we took him. And there's a developmental stage at which you can explain everything. And so, no, I wasn't showing my son pictures of lynchings at the age of 5, but at the age of 10, I've certainly shown him that. And so you want to be able to go and support these issues and help white children understand the historical context that brings about about rage and that brings about anger. I'm not saying that you have to justify things like looting and stealing and things like that, but you do have to develop a framework and a space that allows you to speak intelligently to generations of rage that have been accumulated over time and that are coming out in this way. And it's always great to relate a component or an event to a child's life and something that they can understand. Children experience what we call egocentrism, which makes it sounds like a negative word, but it makes them the center of their world. And that's why a 5-year-old boy would go to visit grandma in the hospital and take her a toy truck, because that would be what made him feel better. And so we have to build connections to children so that they understand how it relates to them. And I feel like it's very valuable if we want to develop anti-racist white children. We have to show them these things early on. My son doesn't have the luxury of remaining innocent because I need him to stay alive. And some people think it's really kind of conjecture when black people speak like that. But we really are in fear for the lives of our children. And if white people don't begin teaching their children what we have to teach our children, we're going to end up in this quandary. I don't want my son having this conversation with his son.
So just a really simple answer. If there's a 5-year-old, black or white child right now who sees a protest and they say, Daddy, what is this about? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you look and you say, people in this world are treated differently. And for some people, they've been being treated differently for a very long time. They've asked for equality. They've asked over and over, and it hasn't happened. And so as a result, they feel like their voice is not being heard. Remember last time when you were asking me for a cookie or Nutella sticks and I didn't hear you? What did you do? You yelled so that you can be heard. These individuals right now, baby, are going through this and they're needing to be heard because their pain is so great. And you can reflect upon a time where you didn't feel heard, and that's exactly what this is. I think that's a verbatim script to be able to talk to a 5-year-old and relate it to them. And when you go into high school and middle school, it's a different conversation. You're literally talking to children about how racism works, how institutionalized systems work, how the black infant mortality rate is off the charts, and that's due to racism.
And what's interesting is you didn't bring race up in your answer to that 5-year-old. Want to get a sense that you are posting these video trainings for parents on Facebook, part of what you're calling Black June. What are those lessons?
Oh, thank you for mentioning that. Black June is my opportunity to help white folk dismantle systematic racism. We all know that black people should not be responsible for training others on how to treat them or how to engage them. However, sometimes those who choose to do so do it. And for me, Black June is an opportunity to help people learn how to dismantle their privilege and move their work from being an ally to an accomplice. A white ally is somebody who goes into the framework, carries a sign, works hard, and speaks out about racism. An accomplice is somebody who has skin in the game. And so as we move through these videos, our next week's segments are going to be focused on helping white people become accomplices. Once they're able to help their kids learn how to be anti-racist, it's their turn to learn information about how to be an accomplice. Maybe that means moving some of your philanthropic dollars to a space that you hadn't thought of before. So things like that. What I'd like to do for Black June is to at the very least, affect 50 people whereby they've actually changed their motivation and behaviors as it relates to this topic of black oppression, black racism, and the specific death of black people, men, women, and children across this nation.
And some adults, lastly, they might feel like they need to better educate themselves on racism in order that they're able to really accurately teach their children. So what resources would you recommend for adults?
There's so many wonderful resources out. My book was published in October, and it's entitled Black Men, Intergenerational Colonialism and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations. And it's a 200,000-year study displaying how across Europe, and the United States, we developed a global economy, and Black lives were implicit in making that happen. It gives the entire history of colonialism of the continent of Africa, and I think that's where people need to begin. Way too often, Americans see the history of African Americans beginning in 1619. We had a history way before that, a history of royalty, and that history needs to be understood, and the complicitness of the European colonists needs to be understood to create a framework where individuals really understand the history of trauma that Black people have experienced. And one last note, if I may, we oftentimes talk about the history of trauma of those who were enslaved. We rarely talk about the intergenerational nature of the oppressor's lens. And when we talk about the fact that there were little girls standing at lynchings who are now grandparents of college students, we don't talk about what that did to them. And so in addition to learning about history, I think people need to dig deep into their own familial history to understand how that lives inside their DNA through epigenetics.
Dr. Donald Grant, really educational. We appreciate that.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys having this segment.
And we continue to monitor scenes of protesters still out across the country. These are the scenes right now playing out in Houston, the home of George Floyd. For the most part, tonight has been relatively peaceful so far compared to what we have seen in recent days, and we certainly hope that that continues. That is our show for tonight. We leave you now with scenes in Los Angeles. Stay tuned to ABC News Live for more context and analysis of the day's top stories. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us, and have a good night.